The professor slammed his hand on the desk and barked, "Stick to cleaning, Calvin. You're just a janitor, not a historian." The students laughed. The auditorium echoed, and Calvin stood frozen, humiliated, beneath a portrait of a white scholar who stole his work decades ago. But that night, while the campus slept, Calvin found a sealed box buried in the archives, and what he uncovered could bring Harvard to its knees. So why did they try to erase him? Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Winter's breath clung to the windows of Harvard's Kirkland Hall, its marble floors polished to a mirror's sheen, as sunlight fractured through Gothic arches. Calvin Reddick moved with quiet rhythm, pushing a wide broom down the corridor, just outside the lecture hall where American History 302 was in full swing. His uniform was clean but worn, his name tag slightly faded, and his posture upright, habitual dignity woven into every step, despite how invisibly he was treated. Students swept past him like a breeze, some offering curt nods, others not even a glance. He was part of the architecture, no more noticeable than the bronze busts lining the walls. Inside the auditorium, Professor Gregory Bennett, a man with decades of tenure and a voice that commanded the room like a gavel, was delivering a lecture on the civil rights movement. He wore his authority like a robe, basking in the silence of 400 undergrads, as he quoted incorrectly a passage from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Calvin, in the hallway, heard it clearly through the double doors slightly ajar. He paused. It wasn't just a minor error, it twisted the meaning. Calvin had read those words in context, taught them once. Before that context was stripped from his life like the titles from his door. For a brief moment, Calvin hesitated. But truth didn't care about status. He stepped inside quietly, waiting for the professor to pause, and then gently said, "Excuse me, sir, I believe Dr. King's exact words were, 'True peace is not merely the absence of tension, it is the presence of justice.'" The room turned. Every head, every eye. The janitor had spoken. Professor Bennett narrowed his eyes, letting silence build pressure like a boiler. Then, with a thin, practiced smile, he leaned on the podium and said, loudly enough for the back row to hear, "Thank you for your, contribution, Mr. Reddick. But perhaps let's leave history to the historians, and let the janitors stick to their mops." Laughter broke out, tentative, then emboldened. Some students chuckled awkwardly. Others cringed. Calvin stood still, not blinking. It wasn't just the insult. It was the room's silence, the permission to humiliate him, gifted by the presence of power. He turned without another word, and exited, pushing his cart forward. Every footstep sounded louder in his ears. Behind him, the professor picked up the lecture without pause, as though the interruption had never happened. In the break room, Calvin sat alone. He didn't touch his sandwich. He didn't speak. The insult wasn't new, but this one hit differently. Maybe because it happened in a hall where he once stood as the lecturer, where students once jotted down his words, not laughs at his expense. He glanced at the corner where an old corkboard still held forgotten notices and faded flyers. A young Maya Alvarez, a journalism student, had walked in to microwave her coffee. She'd heard the story floating around campus, something about a janitor who spoke up and got shut down. She looked at Calvin but said nothing. He simply nodded. She left, unsettled by the weight she felt in the room. As the evening rolled in, the snow thickened outside, blanketing the red brick towers and empty courtyards. The campus was slowing down for winter break. Most students were packing up. Calvin stayed behind. He always did. Holiday shifts meant fewer eyes, fewer comments, and a strange kind of peace. He moved silently through Widener Library, its halls dimmed and empty. The lower levels of the library still held rooms locked for decades, places no longer listed in staff directories. Calvin used to have access, and tonight on a silent impulse he couldn't explain. He walked to one, storage room 1. He still remembered the code. Muscle memory didn't forget, even when the mind tried. The door creaked open into darkness, dust dancing in slants of moonlight. Along the wall was an old metal filing cabinet, dented, cold, and marked in thick red letters. "Do not open. Classified archives." Calvin froze. The cabinet had once been his. Before the accusations, before the fall, he remembered locking it the day he was dismissed, escorted out of the building without a chance to defend himself. They said his work had been inconsistent, politicized, plagiarized, a lie that had followed him into poverty, into isolation, into silence. His hands trembled as he pulled the drawer. Inside were folders thick with research, handwritten notes, and a sealed envelope marked confidential, Reddick thesis draft in 4. Alongside it was something else, a folder bearing the name of Professor Gregory Bennett. As he sifted through the pages, something shifted in Calvin. Not anger, not quite. A cold, crystallized clarity. He saw documents that had been buried, notes he wrote that appeared, months later, in Bennett's published works, with slight alterations. No credit. The theft had always been academic, quiet, almost undetectable. But here was proof that the man who called him just a janitor had built his legacy on the stolen bones of a black scholar's work. The silence of the library deepened. Calvin didn't hear the door behind him swing gently shut. Didn't hear the faint metallic click of a camera lens from the shadowed shelves. Someone had followed him. As Calvin carefully lifted a dust-covered file from the bottom drawer, the floorboard beneath him creaked, and a voice from the shadows whispered, "You were never supposed to find that." The whisper lingered in the dark like a bruise you couldn't see, but knew was there. Calvin Reddick did not turn immediately. His fingers remained inside the drawer, resting on the edge of a folder that felt heavier than paper ever should. Years of silence pressed against his chest as he slowly straightened, the ache in his knees reminding him of how long it had been since he had stood in this room, as anything other than an afterthought. "You were never supposed to find that." The voice came again, softer now, uncertain. It wasn't the voice of authority. It wasn't threatening. That somehow made it worse. Calvin turned. Standing near the door was a young woman, no more than 21, clutching a canvas tote bag and wearing the unmistakable look of someone who had crossed a line without meaning to. Her eyes darted between Calvin and the open cabinet, lingering on the folders spread across the table like exposed wounds. I didn't mean to scare you," she said quickly, words tumbling over each other. "I was looking for archival materials for a final project. This section isn't supposed to be accessible." But the door was open. Calvin studied her face. She wasn't administration. She wasn't security. She was a student, curious, earnest, unprepared for the gravity of what she'd stumbled into. He exhaled slowly and gestured toward the cabinet. "It's all right," he said. "Seems this room has a habit of opening itself when it's tired of being quiet." She stepped closer, eyes catching on the old faculty ID resting on top of the documents. The laminate was cracked, the photo faded but unmistakable. A younger Calvin stared back, sharper jawline, fuller hair, eyes bright with promise instead of restraint. She picked it up carefully. "Calvin Reddick," she read aloud. "Assistant Professor, African American Studies." The silence that followed was not awkward. It was heavy. The kind that demands truth. Calvin nodded once. "That was me." The student's mouth parted slightly, disbelief overtaking caution. "But? You work maintenance. I saw you earlier. In Bennett's lecture." "Yes," Calvin replied. "You saw me." He returned his attention to the documents, lifting the top folder and opening it. Inside were pages of handwritten notes, annotated drafts, letters from publishers that had never seen daylight, margins filled with ideas that had once set him apart, ideas that had later resurfaced under other names. He didn't need to explain. The evidence spoke with cruel clarity. "I was hired in 1983, Calvin continued, voice steady but distant, as if recounting another man's life. One of the youngest black faculty members Harvard had brought on at the time. They called my work disruptive when it was convenient, visionary when it wasn't threatening anyone important. The student Maya," she introduced herself quietly, set the ID down, reverence replacing shock. She listened as Calvin opened another folder, this one thicker, edges worn from being handled too often before being buried. Inside was a thesis draft. His thesis. The one that had cost him everything. "They said I plagiarized a student," Calvin said. "A white graduate student with a powerful advisor. They said my citations were inconsistent, that my methodology lacked originality." Maya frowned. "But this is your handwriting." "Yes," Calvin said. So was the version he submitted 3 months later. He slid out a comparison sheet. 2 columns of text. Phrases mirrored. Arguments aligned too perfectly to be coincidence. Only one carried his name. The other had been published, praised and cited for decades. "They never investigated him," Calvin continued. "They investigated me. Closed doors. No witnesses. No appeals. I was escorted off campus before my next lecture. My office was cleared out by the end of the day." Maya swallowed. "What happened to him?" Calvin's lips curved into something that was not quite a smile. "He teaches here now. Different department. Different building. His name is on grants. On endowed chairs. Maya's hand tightened around the strap of her bag. And you? I applied everywhere. Calvin said. Other Ivy schools. State universities. Community colleges. My name followed me like a warning label. Eventually, even adjunct work dried up. Harvard offered me a custodial position years later. I took it. Why? Maya asked softly. Because they never returned my work. Calvin replied. Because history doesn't stay dead forever. And because I wanted to see what kind of institution they had become. Without me. He lifted another document, an internal memo stamped confidential. It detailed closed-door meetings, faculty votes, language carefully chosen to sound procedural, while dismantling a man's life. Maya read over his shoulder, anger building with every line. They buried this, she said. They buried you. Yes, Calvin said. And then they taught my work to generations of students who never knew my name. Maya looked up, eyes shining. You could expose this. People would care, especially after what happened today. Calvin hesitated. He thought of Bennett's smirk, the laughter, the way humiliation had traveled faster than truth. People care when it's convenient, he said. When it doesn't cost them anything. Maya reached into her bag and pulled out her phone, then stopped herself, glancing at him for permission. I'm a journalism major, she said. I document things. Stories like this don't disappear anymore. Not if someone is willing to listen. Calvin considered her. The room. The cabinet that had waited decades to be opened. The weight in his chest shifted. Unfamiliar and dangerous. Before he could respond, footsteps echoed outside the room. Slow, deliberate. Maya stiffened. Are we allowed to be in here? Calvin closed the drawer halfway. No, he said. Which is exactly why someone will pretend they didn't know this room existed. The footsteps stopped just beyond the door. A shadow passed beneath the frame. Neither of them spoke. Then, after a long moment, the steps retreated. Maya let out a breath. Someone's watching. Yes, Calvin said quietly. They always have been. He gathered the most important documents into a single folder, sliding it into his coat with care that bordered on reverence. This doesn't leave this room, he said. Not yet. Maya nodded, but her eyes lingered on the cabinet, on the truth that had been locked away long enough to rot. Then what happens now? Calvin looked at the faded faculty ID one last time before shutting the drawer completely. The metal groaned in protest, as if resisting silence again. Now, he said, we see who still benefits from pretending I never existed. As they turned toward the door, Maya paused, studying Calvin's face with new understanding, new urgency. The janitor's uniform no longer fit the story she now carried. Wait, she said, voice barely above a whisper. That ID, that's really you, isn't it? Calvin met her gaze. Years of erasure stared back through his eyes. Yes, he said, it always was. Maya's grip tightened on her phone, as a single thought crystallized. If the truth about Calvin Reddick came out, it wouldn't just expose a past injustice. It would threaten powerful people who had spent decades making sure this story stayed buried. The night after discovering the truth, Maya couldn't sleep. She lay awake in her cramped dorm room, blinds half drawn, the glow of her laptop screen casting fractured light across her ceiling. Calvin's story played over and over in her mind, louder than the storm tapping against the window. She had entered that archive room by accident, but now it felt like fate had shoved her into history's forgotten corner and dared her to do something about it. She stared at her phone. A 27-second clip sat in her drafts. She'd recorded it quietly, without Calvin's knowledge. Just the part where he described the plagiarism, the stolen thesis, and the falsified investigation. She hadn't meant to hit record. It was instinct. The same instinct that once made her pick up a camera during a protest in her hometown when police turned their backs on a dying black teen and blamed gang violence. That clip had gone. It was buried beneath the algorithms. But this time was different. This wasn't just a story. This was Harvard, the institution, the symbol, the sacred, untouchable mountaintop of American intellect. And they had erased a black professor, buried him under the title of janitor, and pretended he never existed. Every bone in Maya's body told her, if the world knew, they wouldn't look away. At 2:14 a.m. she tapped post. The caption read, "This is Calvin. He cleans the floors at Harvard. But he used to teach here, and they destroyed his legacy to protect a white student. Justice for Calvin." She closed her phone and tried to forget it. By 6:42 a.m., the post had been viewed over 2.3 million times. By 8:12 a.m., Justice for Calvin was trending #1 on Twitter across the East Coast. By the time she walked across campus for her morning class, Posters had started appearing on lampposts. W2 is Calvin Reddick, and the professor they erased. Maya stood outside the Emerson building and watched a group of students huddled over the video. One of them, a political science major she vaguely recognized, said, "If this is real, it's insane. Why hasn't anyone talked about this?" Another chimed in, "It's Harvard. They bury everything." Maya didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Her phone was already vibrating non-stop. Journalists, activists, even celebrities retweeting the clip with words like disgusting, typical, and unforgivable. Back in Winder Library, Calvin was vacuuming between the rows of study tables when the first student approached him directly. "You're Professor Reddick?" the boy asked, hesitant. Calvin paused, blinked slowly. "I used to be." The student nodded. "Sir, I'm sorry. I had no idea." By the time he finished his shift, 3 more students had come up to him. One offered a handshake. Another said they were dropping Bennett's class in protest. And one, a quiet freshman with big glasses, just stood there silently. Then said, "You changed everything." Calvin wasn't sure what confused him more, the reverence or the sudden exposure. It had all happened too fast. He didn't know about the video yet. Didn't know the clip had reached almost every Ivy League circle before he finished mopping the chemistry building's entrance. He found out later that afternoon, when he walked past a lecture hall and heard his own voice echoing from someone's phone. He stopped, turned, watched 3 students watching him. It wasn't flattery. It was surreal. Like hearing your eulogy while you were still alive. By evening, the Harvard Crimson ran the headline, "Janitor or Professor? The Truth About Calvin Reddick." Subheading, "How a Viral Video Exposed a Forgotten Legacy and a Buried Scandal." But as quickly as the support poured in, so did the backlash. Conservative pundits labeled the video deceptive editing and accused Maya of fabricating quotes to push a racial victimhood agenda. One Fox News anchor called it another woke witch hunt against the white academic establishment. Harvard's administration remained publicly silent for the first 24 hours, but internally they were panicking. That silence broke when Calvin was summoned by name. A sealed envelope, hand-delivered to the janitorial locker room. He sat alone at his small corner desk, the buzz of a flickering fluorescent light overhead, staring at the crimson seal of the dean's office. The envelope was thick, embossed with gold lettering, as if authority could somehow make the paper heavier. He opened it. The letter was direct, too direct. "Mr. Reddick, you are formally requested to attend a private meeting at the office of the dean tomorrow, 9 a.m., room 24. This meeting concerns matters of public conduct, institutional integrity, and potential disciplinary review regarding your recent exposure on social media. You are advised to attend alone. Office of Academic Affairs, Harvard University." Calvin read the letter 3 times. The words weren't accusatory. They were cold, strategic, laced with legal subtext. Potential disciplinary review. For what? Telling the truth? A wave of nausea hit him. It wasn't fear. It was familiarity. He had seen this play before, years ago, when they had summoned him in the same tone, same building, and walked him into his professional grave. He placed the letter down gently and leaned back, letting the silence press against his lungs. A voice cut through it. "Maya." She stood at the doorway, unsure whether she was intruding. "I didn't know they'd come after you like this," she said quietly. Calvin gave a half shake of the head. "You did what you believed was right. But I didn't ask your permission," she said, guilt crawling into her voice. "I should have." He looked at her, studied her, not just as a student, but as someone who had cracked the concrete wall of silence he had learned to survive within. "You lit a match in a building made of dry paper," he said. "Now we both have to deal with the fire." She stepped closer, holding her phone. "There's something you need to see." On the screen was a clip, newly posted. It was Professor Bennett, standing outside his office, flanked by reporters. His face was calm but rigid, like a man trying to hold a dam with his bare hands. "I cannot comment on the validity of the claims made by the individual in question," he said into the microphones. "But I will say that Harvard maintains the highest standards of academic integrity, and we must be cautious in how we define historical truth versus online narrative." Maya's hands tightened. He's dodging it, and they're letting him. Calvin didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence was the kind that told you everything. "I'll come with you," Maya said. "To the meeting. They asked me to come alone." "That doesn't mean you have to." Calvin looked out the window. Snow had begun to fall again, coating the familiar courtyard in a soft, deceptive purity. as if the world could cover injustice just by dressing it in white. "You've already done enough," he said gently. "More than anyone in 30 years. But they can't bury this again," she insisted. "They'll try to call you unstable, say the documents were forged, twist everything." "They can try," Calvin said. "But this time there's a camera on them." For the first time, Maya saw something shift in his posture. Not resignation, but readiness. As she turned to leave, Calvin glanced back at the letter, one last time. His name was typed in bold. Mr. Reddick. Not Professor. Not even Calvin. Just a man waiting for the next erasure. At exactly 8:05 the next morning, Calvin stood outside room 214, only to be greeted not by the dean, but by 3 university lawyers in gray suits, and a sealed folder labeled, "Settlement Proposal, Non-Disclosure Agreement, Termination with Severance." The hallway outside room 214 smelled faintly of old books and polished wood, the kind of manufactured calm that universities perfected to make power feel intellectual, instead of intimidating. Calvin Reddick stood still, letter folded in his coat pocket, as the door opened without ceremony. There was no warm greeting, no invitation to sit casually. Instead, 3 figures waited inside, already seated, already prepared, as if this meeting had been rehearsed long before his name ever trended online. The dean sat at the center of the table, a man whose smile carried the weight of practiced regret. On either side of him were university attorneys, identical in posture and expression, their gray suits blending seamlessly into the cold authority of the room. "Mr. Reddick," the dean began, gesturing toward an empty chair. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." Calvin sat, feeling the chair's stiffness press against his back. The walls were lined with portraits of past Harvard leaders, all white, all staring outward with the confidence of men who had never needed to explain themselves. The dean clasped his hands together, sighing softly, as though burdened by the inconvenience of conscience. "First, let me say this," he said. "On behalf of the institution, I regret the experience you've endured. What happened to you decades ago was unfortunate." Unfortunate. The word landed like an insult disguised as sympathy. "We are aware," the dean continued, "that recent events have caused significant public misunderstanding. Social media has a way of amplifying partial narratives before facts are properly reviewed." One of the attorneys slid a folder across the table, stopping it just short of Calvin's hands. The motion was smooth, almost gentle. Inside were neatly arranged documents, clipped together with a gold fastener. On top, bold letters read, "Confidential Settlement Agreement." "We believe," the dean said carefully, "that the most constructive path forward for you and for Harvard is to resolve this matter privately." Calvin opened the folder slowly. Numbers jumped off the page before the words did. $500,000. Severance. Immediate resignation from his custodial role. A non-disclosure agreement that stretched on for pages, binding him to silence about past allegations, current claims, and any future statements regarding the university. "You want me to disappear," Calvin said evenly. The dean raised his palms in a calming gesture. "Not disappear. Move on. With dignity. With compensation." $500,000, Calvin said, finally looking up. "That's what my career is worth to you." One attorney leaned forward. "This is a generous offer, Mr. Reddick, considering there was no formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing." Calvin let out a short, humorless breath. "You're right," he said. "There was no wrongdoing. Not on your side. That's the problem." The dean's smile tightened. "Let's not be emotional." Calvin met his gaze. "This is emotional. You just prefer it quiet." The room shifted. The air grew heavier. The dean leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "Harvard has survived centuries by handling matters internally. We are offering you closure. Public scrutiny will not restore what you lost. It will only reopen wounds." "That's the point," Calvin said. "They were never allowed to heal. They were covered." Silence followed, sharp and deliberate. One of the attorneys cleared his throat. "If you decline this agreement," he said, "the university will be forced to conduct a formal review. That process can be exhaustive. Reputations may be questioned. Motives examined." "Mine?" Calvin asked. "All involved," the attorney replied. Calvin closed the folder and slid it back across the table. His hands were steady. That surprised him most of all. "I cleaned your floors for 20 years, he said quietly. "I watched students walk across my work without knowing who I was. I swallowed every joke, every look, every reminder that I had been erased. And now you're asking me to erase myself officially." The dean's voice softened again. "Mr. Reddick, this is not a threat. It's an opportunity. Calvin stood. No, he said. It's a bribe. He left the room without waiting for a response. Outside, Maya was pacing. Phone pressed to her ear, her voice tight with restrained anger. She hung up the moment she saw him. What happened? They offered me money, Calvin said. To stay quiet. Her jaw clenched. How much? Enough to buy comfort. Not justice. And you said no? Calvin nodded. Maya exhaled, a mix of relief and fear crossing her face. Then they're going to fight back. They didn't have to wait long. That night, Calvin returned to the janitorial locker room to find his locker door dented, the lock smashed open. Inside, his uniform lay torn, soaked in something dark and sticky. Written across the metal in thick marker were the words, fraud and liar. The cleaning staff pretended not to see it. Silence was safer. Later, in his small off-campus apartment, Calvin noticed the door slightly ajar. The light inside flickered. Drawers were pulled out. Papers scattered. His mattress had been flipped. The folder from the archives was gone. Maya arrived minutes later, breathless. Calvin. He raised a hand, stopping her. His face was calm, but something inside him had hardened. They're not trying to scare me, he said. They're trying to remind me who they think I am. They sat in the wreckage together, the weight of the day pressing down. Maya's phone buzzed constantly. Emails from reporters, activists asking for interviews, anonymous messages warning her to back off. We should release everything, she said. Tonight, before they erase it all. Calvin stared at the empty space where the folder had been. They already tried, he said. Which means it matters. A soft sound at the door made them both freeze. A slip of paper slid slowly across the floor, stopping at Calvin's feet. He picked it up. 3 words. Handwritten, uneven but deliberate. Stop digging, or you'll regret it. As Calvin folded the note, his phone buzzed with an unknown number, and a single text message that read, You think this ends with Harvard? You have no idea how deep this goes. The snow began falling in the late afternoon, first as a whisper, and then as a relentless quiet that swallowed Harvard Yard whole. The ancient red bricks, the stone gargoyles, the echo of footsteps on cobblestone, all were softened under a blanket of white that descended with both beauty and a strange stillness. Most students had already left for Christmas break, their laughter and holiday plans dissipating in the winter air like mist. Dormitories stood nearly empty, lights flickering behind blinds that no longer held watchful eyes. Calvin Reddick walked through it all, with a broom tucked under one arm, and a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with holiday cheer. He had stayed, not out of stubbornness, but out of confrontation with memory. These halls, these labs, these corridors were once his domain in another life, where he stood not as a janitor but as a professor whose voice mattered. Now the silence pressed against him like an accusation. You were here, then you were gone, and still you remain. When he pulled open the front door of the science complex, a sliver of warmth escaped, replaced instantly by the biting cold. His breath formed clouds that dissipated before he could see the end of them. He pushed his cart through the deserted lecture halls, the wheels squeaking faintly in a cadence the empty rooms seemed to listen to. Somewhere in the distance, the clock tower chimed. 6 times, then 6 again, measuring time in a place that once measured his ambitions. He reached the chemistry labs, his footsteps slow, reverent, almost reluctant. These rooms had once hosted discussions, where he debated pedagogy and legacy with students who scribbled down notes eagerly. Now they housed only glass beakers and polished countertops, instruments of learning devoid of learners. The building was quiet, but not peaceful. The quiet felt like a held breath, waiting for something it feared to release. Earlier that day, Maya had stopped by to say goodbye before she left campus for the holidays. Her car packed with recorder equipment, press credentials, and the hopeful eyes of journalists who had promised to return after the break. She had found Calvin by the loading dock, sorting trash bags and wiping down concrete steps with the practiced motions of someone who didn't want to stand still too long. When she saw his face, she hesitated, as if realizing only then that a part of him would remain behind even when the world moved forward. I'll be back, she told him, her voice a mixture of urgency and warmth. They want to hear the full story. National coverage, documentaries, features. People are talking, Calvin, and they're not letting this go. Calvin had nodded, his eyes on the ground. Be careful, he said, not as a warning but as something softer, an acknowledgement that truth pursued can sometimes collide with forces that don't want it known. She had squeezed his arm, smiled, and left before he could say anything else. As her car disappeared, a strange emptiness followed in her absence, as if her presence had momentarily tethered him to consequences beyond his custodial duties. Now alone on Christmas Eve, Calvin pushed his cart past the glass doors. Entering the lab wing, fluorescent lights hummed overhead, their buzz the only sound aside from his footsteps. The deeper he moved into the labs, the heavier the air felt, like the rooms were remembering what had once been spoken there, like the walls had ears and hearts. He began with the lecture halls, tossing out chalk dust and eraser scraps, wiping down boards that once held narratives and debate. Then, as the snow thickened outside, he made his way toward the chemistry wing, a place where students once balanced equations under his watchful eye, where curiosity had once illuminated every pair of young faces. The closer he got to Lab 4, the more the air seemed to change, cooler, dense, and still. Calvin didn't know if it was his imagination or memory that made his heartbeat slow and deepen, but he pushed the thought aside. He had cleaned harsher rooms. He had swept tougher corridors. This was just another shift, another layer of the same silence he had been living in for years. He reached Lab 4 and flicked the light switch. A soft buzz, then white glare. Beakers lined the counters like silent sentinels, rows of glass waiting for human curiosity that had gone home for Christmas. Calvin took a slow breath and stepped inside, cart at his side. He was pulling abandoned paper scraps into the waste bin when he heard it. A faint beep. It was soft at first, like the echo of a dream before wakefulness. But then it sounded again, deliberate, rhythmic, human-made. Calvin froze. The beep came from near the back of the lab, beside a locked storage cabinet he had never opened, the one that held equipment for advanced student research. He hadn't been near it in years. The sound was out of place, at once too purposeful to be random, and too hidden to be accidental. He set his cart down, every nerve in his body alert. The snow outside rattled against the windows, but inside the lab was eerily still. The beep sounded again, low and steady. Calvin approached the cabinet slowly, dread knotting in his gut. Not fear of danger, but fear of meaning. It didn't feel like a mistake. It felt like an invitation. He knelt down, chest tightening with every breath, and saw a faint glow beneath the locked cabinet. A pulsing ring of red light, just visible through the narrow crack at the bottom. It blinked in time with the beeping. Something wasn't right. His mind raced, first leaping to the irrational. Maybe an old research device left running by students. Maybe a leftover lab experiment gone unnoticed. But that didn't fit with the silence. Didn't fit with how the light and sound felt purposeful, deliberate. Something placed. Something waiting. Calvin rose slowly, his face drawn in the harsh lab light. The feeling in the pit of his stomach wasn't fear. It was confusion and disbelief mixed with an unsettling awareness that he was once again standing on the verge of something he had never asked for. He could almost hear Maya's voice in his head, telling him to be careful, to think of consequences, to remember that truth often walks hand in hand with danger. He reached out and touched the cool metal handle of the cabinet. It was locked, as always, no sign of forced entry. But the beeping continued, urgent, now echoing in the stillness. Calvin's breath rattled. The sound wrapped around him, stretching the seconds into long moments that felt like lifetimes. He leaned down again and peered closer at the glow. Close enough to see faint wires running beneath the cabinet, invisible until now. They were thin, professional, not amateur, and the blinking red light wasn't coming from a forgotten instrument. It was mechanical, intentional, designed. His heart hammered, but his voice was steady. Who would? The question died in his throat, because in that instant, the lab's automatic doors swooshed open behind him. Unexpected, sudden, and too silent. Calvin didn't need to turn around to know someone was there. The air changed. The room felt watched. He stood freezing, every instinct telling him this moment was not random. This was no abandoned device. This was a message. Something engineered, timed, and placed in a space tied to his past, and now to his present. A whisper of footsteps, barely audible, echoed through the lab. Calvin didn't look back. His eyes stayed fixed on the faint pulsing light beneath the cabinet. The unknown beneath metal and lock. The beep grew louder, faster, and then a voice, cold, measured, unmistakable in its intent, broke the silence. Didn't expect to find this on Christmas Eve, did you? Calvin's breath caught as the voice continued from the shadows, familiar yet warped with menace. We told you to stop digging, but you never listen. Now you'll see just how far the truth can bury a man. Calvin didn't move. The voice had sliced through the sterile stillness of the lab, like a blade, sharp and deliberate. Whoever it was, they remained behind him, cloaked in the shadows of the doorway, unseen but fully present. The red glow beneath the cabinet blinked faster now, no longer ambient, but urgent, maniacal, real. "I asked you a question," the voice said again, this time a touch louder, laced with something performative. "Not exactly how you imagined spending Christmas Eve, huh? Poking your nose into places you don't belong." Calvin turned slowly. But there was no one. The lab doors stood open, swaying slightly with the cold draft. Empty. It had been a recording. He stared at the floor for a moment longer, then turned back to the cabinet. A creeping sensation slithered up his spine as he crouched and lifted the edge of the bottom panel, using a flathead key from his cart. The metal plate slid open with surprising ease, almost like it was meant to be found. Inside, nestled in a small hollow space beneath the storage shelf, sat a compact device. Wires curled tightly around a cylindrical core. A cheap digital timer sat at its center, glowing red with precise clarity. 0004517. Calvin blinked. A bomb. It wasn't speculation. It wasn't paranoia. It was real, tightly wired, industrial and terrifying in its quiet confidence. Whoever built it hadn't intended chaos. They'd engineered certainty. Every element was clean, compact, and ominously efficient. Calvin's instincts kicked in. He stepped back, breath held, scanning the room for any movement, any sign of the voice's source. But there was nothing. Just the hum of fluorescent lights, and the hiss of cold wind pressing against the lab windows. A bomb. At Harvard. On Christmas Eve. Hidden beneath a locked cabinet in a building long emptied for the break. His first thought was security. He reached for his phone. No signal. He rushed into the hallway toward the emergency call box mounted near the stairwell. The red light was off. He picked up the receiver and pressed it to his ear. Dead. No tone, not even static. He ran down the corridor toward the west exit and slammed the panic alarm mounted on the wall. Nothing. The power flickered. Just for a second. Enough to make every light dim, the hallway darken, and every buried trauma in his chest jump like a startled heartbeat. He was alone, not just metaphorically, but logistically. The entire building was silent. The university's skeleton staff was spread thin across a dozen buildings. It would take too long for anyone to notice something was wrong. And the only person who knew where Calvin was had left for the holidays. Maya. He bolted back into the lab, heart pounding. The timer was now at... He stared at it for a moment, his hands trembling. Then he looked around the lab, eyes scanning shelves and drawers. He'd taught chemistry here once, long enough ago that the layout was different, but not enough to forget the basics. He knew that bomb construction of this sort could be homemade, but this wasn't amateur. It had layers, professionalism masked in simplicity. He wasn't a bomb expert, but he was trained in patterns, logic, systems, and this thing had a rhythm. It wasn't designed to be hidden forever. It was meant to be discovered, just in time. That's when it hit him. This was a performance. It wasn't meant to be just destruction. It was spectacle, a message wrapped in chaos. Calvin's mind moved quickly now, every second slicing into what little time he had. He scanned the wires, 4 visible red, green, blue and black, attached to a narrow circuit board, tightly fitted. Not a timer to a simple explosive, but a sequence-driven trigger. He knew better than to touch it without understanding it. But he also knew something else. This lab was in the historic West Wing. If it detonated, it wouldn't just damage buildings. It would destroy a legacy, destroy him by implication, even if he survived. A black janitor. Alone. No alibi. No proof. With the bomb. His mind flashed back to the smear campaign, the erased thesis, the silence that followed. This wasn't just about damage. It was about blame. He needed help, but there was no signal, no landline, no staff, no Maya. His eyes scanned the corners of the lab for any motion sensor or surveillance. But the power flicker earlier likely killed all internal monitoring. He knew this because he had cleaned the systems. He'd been assigned to that very wing just last semester when the new security update failed during a thunderstorm. He looked again at the device. WA03651. Suddenly, another beep echoed down the hall. But this one was different. Shorter, faster. Not the same device. Not the same countdown. He left the lab at a sprint, following the sound past the stairwell and toward the basement elevator shaft. The old access elevator used for equipment, off-limits to students, was propped open by a small black tool case. He stepped inside. There in the far left corner, beneath a plastic bin of hazardous disposal signage, another device blinked. This one smaller, simpler, but the timer was faster. 000832. Calvin froze. This bomb wasn't designed for the wing. This was designed for the elevator shaft. A structural choke point. If this blew, the foundation of the West Wing would collapse. The entire structure could come down, with him in it. 2 bombs, 2 timelines, and nobody watching. Unless someone was watching. He turned his head slowly, scanned the elevator walls, and saw it, a small lens tucked in the corner, barely visible under the emergency light casing. A wireless security cam. Not university issued. Someone had set this up, and someone was watching him now. His breath slowed, not from calm but from an eerie realization. They wanted to see what he would do. They were testing him. He stepped back into the hallway, trying to keep his thoughts clear, sharp. This wasn't random. It was precise, calculated, targeted, and most importantly, he glanced back once more at the elevator bomb. 0007. The lab bomb had nearly 31 minutes left. One was designed to kill. The other, to cause confusion, panic, maybe draw people toward the blast, or away from something else. He pulled out his phone again. Still dead. Then he saw the thin line of copper wire running along the floor, just under the baseboards, carefully taped, perfectly aligned, and disappearing down a side hallway toward the library archives. His heart dropped. This wasn't about destroying buildings. This was about erasing something. Again, just like they erased him. But this time it wasn't academic. It was real, physical, irreversible. He took off running down the hallway, following the copper wire, praying he was wrong. As he turned the final corner, breath ragged, sweat freezing on his neck, he stopped dead in his tracks. Another device sat beneath the archive room's steel door, and its timer read. Calvin Reddick stood frozen in the dimly lit corridor that led to the archives, the copper wire snaking beneath the baseboards like a hidden vein feeding something dark and alive. His heartbeat slammed against his ribs, but his mind was already racing, tightening around a truth he had instinctively sensed ever since the first device blinked beneath that locked chemistry cabinet. Whoever was behind this didn't want chaos. They wanted attention, and they wanted a reckoning that dragged old wounds back into the light. But for what purpose? For whose vengeance? His breath misted in the chill stillness, each exhale trembling with fear, frustration, and the weight of unfinished history. He forced himself to focus, stepping past the elevator, and toward the archives, where the third device's countdown ticked mercilessly against his ears. Seconds remaining, not just against him, but against every life tethered to this campus. But as he advanced, memories from years ago, a scandal he had long tried to bury, stirred like shadows waking on a cold morning. He remembered a student, Malcolm James, brilliant, passionate, unrelenting in protests against microaggressions and systemic dismissal of racial complaints. Malcolm had accused the administration of turning a blind eye to the harassment that drove his younger brother Darius into isolation and eventually suicide. The case had become a spectacle, then a whisper, then nothing at all, a casualty of bureaucracy and ego. Calvin had been one of the few faculty members who tried to help, yet despite his efforts, Darius's death was written off as a tragedy with no clear responsibility, and Malcolm was expelled for disruptive conduct, branded a threat rather than a grieving brother. It had never sat right with Calvin, but he had stayed quiet, anonymity his shield, silence his prison. Now, as he reached the steel doors of the archives, those memories coiled inside him, linking like puzzle pieces to something far more sinister than he ever expected. The faint glow beneath the door was there again, a blinking heartbeat of malice and intent. This wasn't random. This was personal. Someone had waited decades not only for revenge against Harvard, but for vindication against those who had ignored the pleas of a black family crushed under institutional arrogance. And Calvin knew, deep in his bones, that the architect of this terror might be someone whose pain had metastasized into something far darker. But when he pulled open the heavy door, what he saw gave him a bolt of cold shock, something more unexpected than the fuse's steady tick. There was no bomb yet, just pages and files scattered on the floor, toppled shelves and outdated portraits of former deans staring down like accusatory sentinels. It was chaos masquerading as a clue, and in the midst of the disorder he found the unmistakable handwriting of Malcolm James, the same radical student who had once stormed faculty meetings with righteous fury. Calvin's breath hitched. He hadn't seen Malcolm in over 20 years, not since the expulsion. Rumors swirled that Malcolm took his trauma and transformed it into something radioactive and isolated, but no one knew where he went, or what became of him. Until now. The archive floorboards near the back were stained with spilled coffee, yellowing paper, and a single typed note pinned under a toppled bookshelf. Too many voices ignored. Too many truths buried. I am the instrument of exposure. Calvin's pulse thundered. Was Malcolm back? And if so, was he the one behind these devices? His rage forged into calculus of destruction. The static hum of the device's countdown snapped him out of the swirl of memory. He hurried toward the back corner, only to nearly stumble over another factor he didn't expect. A student ID lying face up, worn but familiar. It was Malcolm's ID. The date expired long ago, but anyone who looked closely could see the name and photograph slightly faded but unmistakable. He bent down, fingers trembling with conflicting emotion. The old faculty professor, the janitor, the accidental target of a viral uproar, now grasping the tangible mark of someone he once tried to help. A part of him wanted to remember Malcolm as the brilliant, angry young man, before hatred swallowed him, before betrayal reshaped his destiny into something vengeful and corrosive. But the ticking device reminded him that sentiment wasn't currency here. Lives were at stake, and the only way to honor history was to confront it, not excuse it. He scanned the cluttered floor, eyes narrowing on a dark smudge at the back of a fallen cabinet. A fingerprint smudged but deeply pressed into the wood. That strike hit him like recognition through ice water. The same handwriting on the note matched the smudge pattern. Someone meticulous, someone personally invested. Someone fueled by a past injustice that had never been acknowledged. Just then, the soft beep of a phone cut through the eerie quiet. Calvin reached into his coat for his device. Still no reception, but somehow the vibration against his thigh was palpable. One message. The screen lit up with a single notification. You found my workspace. Impressive. But Harvard knows far more than you think. No number. No signature. Just words that dripped with meaning, with warning, and with a darkness Calvin recognized as more than radical rhetoric. It was obsession. His breath tightened. What was done in anger could be destructive, but what was done in desperation could be catastrophic. He backed out of the archives, slowly, scanning every shadow for danger he couldn't yet define. His eyes darted toward the science wing direction. The possibility that more devices had been planted, that the clock might already be bleeding seconds too fast to calculate. His steps were careful, his thoughts honed on survival and truth, not revenge or accusation. But underlying it all was the knowledge that someone believed this dramatic stage of terror would force Harvard to face its failures. Then, just as he reached the hallway, a soft footsteps echoed behind him. Not loud, not close, but enough to make him turn. In the doorway stood a figure with a long coat, hood dropped low, face obscured by the dim lights. Calvin's throat went dry, pulse thrumming against his ears. The stranger's posture was still, collected, like someone confident in their purpose. I didn't think you'd make it this far, the voice said, familiar but altered, echoing from where Calvin least expected it. His breath caught, because the voice wasn't Malcolm's. It was Professor Bennett's. Calvin blinked, confused but certain. Bennett leaned against the frame, eyes cool, lips curved in a thoughtful line. Not smug, not frantic, but eerily poised. You've stirred up old ghosts, Bennett said, his tone lower than Calvin had ever heard it before, almost fragile. But some secrets are safer left buried. Calvin stared at him. Disbelief and rising dread knotted together. What are you doing here? Bennett stepped inside the archive, gaze flicking over the scattered papers, the ruined sanctity of the institution they had both known. I came to stop this, he said. Malcolm's gone too far. If this bomb goes off, Harvard will be lost forever. Calvin felt a cold stab of shock, not because Bennett talked about harm, but because he said Malcolm, as if the professor knew someone intimately tied to the truth that had cost Calvin his career all those years. You know him? Calvin asked, voice tight.
Bennett swallowed, eyes shadowed. When his brother died, they both came to me. I tried to help, but I was out of my depth. I said the wrong words. I dismissed their pain, and the university dismissed mine. I thought I buried that guilt, but he never did.
Calvin's mind raced. Bennett, who had publicly humiliated him just weeks ago, now standing here, admitting complicity in a chapter of history that had been ignored, rewritten, excused. It was more than ironic, it was poison. But before Calvin could respond, the countdown chimed again, sharper, closer. He followed Bennett's gaze to the far end of the hall. At the podium in the old lecture hall, where Bennett taught, something glowed beneath it. A faint red pulse. Another device. But this one wasn't hidden in a basement or tucked beneath wiring that needed intuition to find. This one sat right beneath the place of authority, where Bennett lectured, where he wielded influence, where Calvin's legacy was once usurped. A third bomb. And its signal was unmistakable. As Calvin stared at the blinking red light, Bennett whispered nearly to himself, "You think this is about destruction, but this one was placed where the truth is taught." Calvin Reddick moved fast, heart hammering, shoes echoing through the narrow corridor of the historic West Wing. The pulsing light beneath Professor Bennett's podium was no longer a mystery. It was a declaration. The third bomb wasn't hidden. It was planted boldly, deliberately, beneath the symbol of academic power. The podium from which Bennett taught, where his voice had once drowned out Calvin. Now that very place pulsed with a countdown designed to rip away the illusion of legacy and respectability. Harvard had carefully preserved, but Calvin couldn't afford to stop and ponder symbolism. He had maybe 20 minutes left, 3 bombs, 3 triggers, and no certainty that they were even the last ones. He rushed to the back exit, pulling the emergency bar with all his weight. Nothing. The heavy door clicked, but did not open. He slammed his fist against it, tried again, still locked. He bolted down the adjoining hallway toward the next emergency exit, passing cleaning signs and half-dried floors where the janitorial night crew had been stationed just an hour ago. He'd seen them, 3 older men and 1 young woman. They were in the East dorms when he started his shift. He had to warn them. He reached the second door, pushed the release. Again, nothing, no response. The locking mechanism didn't even click. The red emergency light above the door blinked twice and went dark. He turned and sprinted toward the elevator. Pressed the button. No response. Every electronic system was failing, silently. He moved toward the fire stairwell, nearly losing his footing on the slick tile. He descended 2 flights and pushed through the door leading into the utilities corridor that connected to the East dorms. He emerged into a back hallway lined with cleaning carts and mop buckets. But the lights were flickering here too, like the wing itself was exhaling its final breath. Calvin called out, "Anthony, Maria, you hear?" No answer, just the dull buzz of dying electricity and the hum of silence. He walked deeper into the corridor until he reached the janitor's common lounge, empty. Not a coat, not a bag, not a soul. He stopped, looked around, and then he saw it, a piece of red tape on the wall. No note, no writing, just red tape. That's when he noticed the cameras, small, unfamiliar, tucked into corners that hadn't had any surveillance the day before. These weren't Harvard's cameras. Someone had installed their own system, a private network. They're watching everything. His stomach turned. Whoever planted the bombs hadn't just planned destruction, they had mapped his every move. Which meant the others, the night crew, were probably gone, either evacuated early or never even there. A diversion, a decoy, a false sense of company in a building that had been designed to feel full, right until the trap sealed shut. And he was trapped. Fully. He turned back, racing up the stairwell, lungs burning. The floor vibrated faintly now, not from explosion, but from something more sinister. Remote overrides. Artificial lockdowns. He pushed open the stairwell door, and again it resisted. He yanked harder. This time the door gave, but with a strange metallic groan, like something inside had been rewired. He returned to the second bomb, the one in the basement elevator shaft. Time ticking faster now. His hands trembled as he knelt beside it. The wires were still tight, still glowing, still untouched. He didn't have training in bomb disposal, but he had taught generations of students how molecules behaved under pressure, how conductivity worked, how electricity followed logic, even when humans didn't. He didn't have a bomb squad. He had his instincts, and his mind. He reached into his jacket, pulled out the small leather notepad he always carried, filled with chemistry notes, equations, forgotten fragments of lessons never taught. He scribbled quickly, wiring colors, voltage approximations, energy diffusion models. The components in the device weren't complicated, but their configuration was intentionally misleading. Whoever designed this didn't want brute force to diffuse it. They wanted someone to understand the underlying science. Calvin squinted closer. The wires weren't attached to a pressure plate. They were part of a magnetic relay loop. That meant touching one would trigger the entire sequence, unless the current could be shorted safely. He reached for a piece of insulated wire on a broken janitorial vacuum nearby, stripped it, and created a makeshift ground loop. His palms were slick with sweat. The timer glowed now. He slid the wire carefully into place, breathing shallowly. His fingers shook. One wrong move, and the whole system would convert into a detonation trigger. He paused, closed his eyes, then slowly, with the steadiness of a man who had nothing left to lose, he lifted the blue wire. The timer flashed once, then dimmed, paused. The red glow blinked. 00927. 00927. He had stopped the countdown, at least temporarily. He sat back on his heels, exhaling like a man who had forgotten how. His hands dropped to his knees, trembling now in relief, in adrenaline, in disbelief. But just as he reached for his notebook again, something shifted in the hallway behind him. A voice, sharp, male, deliberate, cut through the silence. "You shouldn't have stayed, Professor Reddick." Calvin turned. A figure stepped from the shadows, tall, lean, wearing a Harvard maintenance badge that looked authentic until you noticed the edges were laminated by hand. The man's face was familiar. Calvin's eyes narrowed. It was Malcolm James, but older, tired, weathered by something far deeper than age. Malcolm stepped closer, hands up, not threatening, but intense. "You weren't supposed to be here," he said. "I planned everything to the second, every blind spot, every dead camera, every moment of weakness they never saw coming. And then you decided to come back." Calvin stood slowly, heart pounding, rage and heartbreak swirling in equal measure. "You tried to kill students." "No," Malcolm snapped. "I tried to kill the lie, the one they protected, the one they built over my brother's grave." Calvin's throat tightened. "You think this is justice? This is visibility," Malcolm whispered. "No one listened when we begged for help. No one listened when you were framed. No one listened when Darius died. But they'll listen now, even if it's too late." "You're wrong," Calvin said quietly. "People are listening now." "They finally are." Malcolm stared at him. The fire in his eyes flickered, not gone but confused. "You think going viral changes anything?" Calvin took a step forward. "No, but it means we don't have to be invisible anymore." The silence between them held decades of betrayal, pain, and unspoken grief. But then another sound, behind them, from the direction of the upper hallway. A voice. Female. Clear. "Calvin, are you okay?" Calvin froze. "Maya." Malcolm's eyes darkened instantly. He whispered, "She wasn't supposed to be here." And then from the ceiling above came the unmistakable click of a pressure plate activating. The sharp metallic click echoed above them like a countdown disguised as silence. Calvin's blood turned cold. He didn't need to look up to know what it meant. Somewhere in the ceiling, a pressure plate had just been triggered. Maya stood still behind him, halfway down the corridor, her body frozen in instinct, her eyes wide with questions she hadn't had time to form. She had come back. She wasn't supposed to be here. And Malcolm, no, Elias was already recalibrating the unfolding chaos with terrifying calm. Elias turned sharply, his expression twisting, not in surprise but in betrayal. "She wasn't in the plan," he growled, voice shaking with fury barely held together. "She's media. If she dies, this becomes martyrdom. If she lives, this becomes theater." Calvin positioned himself between Elias and Maya. "You're too deep in it, Malcolm. You've become the thing you hated, someone who thinks the only way to be heard is to destroy everything around you." "Don't call me that name," Elias hissed. "That name was a student. That name begged for help. That name trusted Harvard to protect Black lives. And Harvard buried that name with Darius." His voice dropped into something low and violent. Elias was born from the silence, from their smirks, from professors who knew what was happening, and still chose their tenure over truth. Calvin didn't flinch. "I tried. I was one of the few who listened." Elias took a step closer, his eyes dark with contempt. "You listened and then you disappeared. They buried you, and you let them. You vanished into the janitor's closet and locked the door behind you. We needed you to fight, and instead you polished their floors." The words hit hard. Harder than Calvin expected, because they weren't entirely untrue. He had accepted survival over justice, silence over risk. He had believed that his dignity could be preserved in quiet. And maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong. But this wasn't the answer either. "You don't punish Harvard by killing its ghosts," Calvin said, voice firm. "You become another one." Elias smiled bitterly. "That's the point. You think I care about surviving this? You think this is about me? No. I've spent 20 years building this moment. 3 bombs. 1 message. Harvard's illusion dies tonight. And people like you, who made peace with the enemy, don't get to stop it." He pulled a small remote from his coat and held it up between two fingers. Walk away now, Elias said, eyes locked on Calvin. Let it all burn, or stay and go down with them. Behind him, Maya took a step forward. You're not a savior. You're a headline waiting to fade. You want Harvard to be exposed. There's 1,000 cameras out there now, ready to tell the story. Elias turned his head slowly. You think cameras change systems? That's adorable. And with a slight smirk, he raised the remote. In that flash of a moment, Calvin remembered something from his janitorial days. Something nobody else had paid attention to. A long-forgotten manual override to the emergency water suppression system, installed during a renovation after a lab fire 2 decades ago. No one used it anymore, but it was still wired, still there, and he knew exactly where the hidden panel was, buried behind a maintenance grate, just 5 feet behind him. Calvin shifted his stance, keeping eye contact with Elias. He lowered his right hand slowly to his belt, where his old custodian keys hung like relics. With careful precision, he slid one into the grate behind him, turning it as softly as he could, while continuing to speak. Tell me, Elias, he said, voice measured. How many lives are worth one legacy? Elias narrowed his eyes. Harvard's taken too many already. The lock clicked open with a sound too faint to notice under the hum of tension in the hallway. Calvin pressed the override. Suddenly, shh, a thunderous burst overhead. Water exploded from the ceiling sprinklers, soaking everything in seconds. The hallway lit up with chaos. Lights popped and short-circuited. Sparks flew. Maya screamed, ducking as the hallway plunged into semi-darkness. Elias cursed, dropping the remote as a sharp electric jolt ran through his soaked coat. In the confusion, Calvin lunged, not to attack Elias, but to grab the dropped remote. But as his fingers brushed it, Elias kicked it down the hallway and bolted into the darkness, his silhouette swallowed by shadow and mist. Maya, stay here, Calvin shouted, grabbing the remote before it slid into a drain. Call someone. Anyone. I've already been recording, she shouted back, holding up her soaked phone. But we have another problem. Look, she pointed toward the far end of the corridor, where a red blinking light was flashing through the haze like a lighthouse in a storm. A new bomb. They rushed toward it, water sloshing under their feet. The blinking grew faster. The device was planted just outside the entrance to the library archives, the sacred heart of Harvard's buried Black history collection. Calvin knelt beside it. Unlike the others, this bomb was newer, smaller, more compact, and deadlier. Timer, 0014, 15 minutes. Maya stood above him, heart pounding, still recording. This one wasn't here before. He must have planted it right after we left earlier. Calvin examined the wiring complex. Less amateur than the others. This one wasn't just a statement. It was intended to level the entire archive wing. You said there were 3 bombs, Maya said, trying to hold her voice steady. There are 4, Calvin replied. Or more. He's escalating. And this one's meant to destroy evidence, not people. The implication hung heavy in the air. This was no longer about symbolic damage. It was about erasure. The archive held documents that even Calvin had never had access to. Sealed records, donation correspondences, minutes from administrative meetings that revealed how Harvard had handled internal racism complaints. Elias wasn't just angry, he was aiming for a clean slate, one no one could ever trace back. Calvin stared at the bomb. 15 minutes. No help. No team. No time. He looked up at Maya. Go find someone. If I can't stop this. No, she snapped. I'm not leaving. You don't get to be a martyr. You can't help with this. Yes, I can, she said. I can make sure the world sees it. All of it. He couldn't argue with that. He nodded once, then bent closer to the device. As he examined the final circuit, a small display screen on the device flickered to life, showing a pre-recorded video. Elias's face filled the screen. He stared directly into the lens and said, Calvin, this one's for you. And then the timer accelerated, dropping to 10 hours in an instant. The image of Elias on the bomb's screen vanished, replaced by the cold, relentless countdown, 10 hours 9:58. The red digits glowed like a mechanical heartbeat, in the shadows, pulsing with intention. Calvin stared at it, jaw tight, his mind racing not just against time but against memory. This bomb was not designed for mass casualties. It was symbolic, deliberate, and cruel in its precision. It was aimed at the Black History Archives, the very collection Calvin had helped build decades ago, when he still believed institutions could be reformed from within. Those shelves held stories, Harvard never wanted framed on its walls. Letters from black students pushed out quietly. Faculty complaints buried under legal language. Handwritten journals of resistance that never made it into syllabi. Elias wasn't trying to kill people here. He was trying to erase proof. If this bomb went off, it wouldn't just destroy paper, it would finish the job Harvard had started years ago. Water from the sprinkler system was already seeping down the stairwell, dripping into the basement like a warning. The irony was brutal. Fire and water, both enemies of fragile history, closing in at once. Maya stood a few steps back, phone raised, her face pale but determined. "If this goes off," she said quietly, "everything down there is gone." Calvin didn't answer right away. He was already thinking past the bomb, past the wires, past the timer. He knew this archive. He had designed parts of it, and he remembered something most people had forgotten. A single fireproof trunk, hidden beneath the oldest shelf, reinforced with steel and insulation, meant to protect the most sensitive documents if disaster ever came. It was a contingency no one ever believed they'd need. Until now. "We're not stopping this here," Calvin said finally, standing. "We're saving what we can." He turned and ran down the stairs, his knees aching, breath heavy, Maya right behind him. The basement door groaned open to reveal the archive room, half drowned in mist, shelves slick with water, paper already beginning to curl and bleed ink. Calvin didn't hesitate. He moved straight to the center shelf, dropped to his knees, and found the trunk exactly where he remembered it. Black, scarred, untouched by time. His hands shook as he unlocked it with a key he'd carried for 20 years, without knowing why he couldn't throw it away. Inside were sealed folders, audio tapes, photographs, manifestos and testimonies that had never seen daylight. Lives that history books had skipped over on purpose. Maya stared down into the trunk, her voice breaking. This is everything." Calvin nodded. "This is what they didn't want to remember." Together they tried to lift it. But the weight surprised them both. Decades of erased voices were heavier than silence. They dragged it across the floor inch by inch, water soaking their clothes. Calvin's palms splitting open against the metal edge. The bomb's countdown echoed faintly from above, amplified now, taunting them. 6:44. Elias wanted them to hear it, wanted them to feel time pressing against their spines. Halfway up the stairs, Calvin stumbled. The trunk slammed into his leg, pain flashing white across his vision, as he dropped to one knee. For a moment the thought crossed his mind to let go, to tell Maya to run, to save herself in the story. But when he looked up at her, saw the resolve in her eyes, he knew leaving was no longer an option for either of them. They lifted again, grunting, pushing past the pain, emerging finally into the corridor, where snowlight spilled through shattered windows. Sirens wailed in the distance now. Police, fire trucks, the outside world finally paying attention. They made it into the open air just as the ground beneath them shuddered. A deep, violent boom tore through the night, followed by a shockwave that knocked Calvin flat. Glass exploded outward from the west wing. Smoke poured into the sky. The podium bomb. A distraction. Not the archives. Not yet. Maya's phone buzzed wildly. On the screen, a live security feed showed Elias running toward the east tower, soaked and unhurried, like a man still in control. And beneath the footage, a new alert blinked red. Another timer. 15 minutes. Different location. Calvin looked up from the phone to the library roof just as a low mechanical hum cut through the snowfall. A blinking red light hovered above the building, growing brighter with every second. His chest tightened as the truth landed. This wasn't over. The archives had been saved for now. But Elias had moved the battlefield. A fourth bomb was already in the air. The sound of the explosion lingered in the sky, long after the smoke began its slow ascent. The west wing of the lecture hall, once home to centuries of academic debate and polished illusion, now lay fractured, half collapsed, bleeding stone and glass into the snowy quad. Sirens screamed from every direction, converging like wolves to fresh blood. Floodlights painted the crumbling walls in harsh whites and reds. But in the center of it all, bruised, bleeding, and breathless, stood Calvin Reddick, clutching the fireproof trunk like a shield made of ghosts. He didn't hear the police at first, or the orders being barked into megaphones. His ears rang with the shockwave. His legs barely held, and still he refused to drop the trunk. Maya was 10 steps behind him, waving frantically, shouting something he couldn't hear. Her voice was drowned beneath the static of emergency radio chatter and the low hum of drones circling overhead. And then suddenly, red lasers cut across his chest. Flashlights, commands, Drop the bag, hands in the air. Now, Calvin's head lifted slowly. What? Why? He opened his mouth, but words were swallowed by the chaos. Officers surged toward him, weapons drawn. The air thickened with accusation. They weren't seeing the survivor. They were seeing the suspect. Maya pushed forward, still screaming. He saved the archives. He's not the bomber. But they didn't listen. They had already decided what they saw. An older black man, near an explosion, dragging a heavy trunk, covered in soot. No ID, no rank, no uniform. And just like that, Calvin was no longer the man who defused 2 bombs, who carried history through fire and water. He was just a janitor found near the blast. The moment collapsed. Calvin felt the weight shift. The reality that everything he'd done would be rewritten in real time. Just like before. Erased again, but this time with handcuffs and headlines. An officer lunged, tackled him to the ground. His face hit the snow-hard concrete. The trunk spilled open. Papers fluttering into the wind like confessions scattered in panic. Maya screamed, "No, you don't understand." But the cuffs clicked shut before her voice could catch up. News vans had already parked along the perimeter. Reporters grabbed their microphones. Photographers snapped their shots. A drone zoomed in on Calvin's face, bloodied from the pavement, eyes wide with exhaustion and disbelief. One of the guards lifted a black binder from the wreckage of the trunk, pages shaking in the breeze. Then another officer emerged holding something different. A manifesto, typed, signed, Calvin Reddick. The headline wrote itself before sunrise, "Black Janitor Behind Harvard Bomb Plot." It spread like gasoline catching a spark. Anonymous law enforcement sources leaked that the suspect had deep institutional resentment and a history of radical behavior. Video surveillance surfaced showing Calvin near the chemistry lab, and again near the archives. Out of context, it looked damning. No one questioned why he was holding wires, or why he was pulling a safety trunk instead of running. A university spokesperson speaking off record stated, "We will conduct a full investigation but are shocked by the betrayal of trust." By morning, half the country had seen his face. The rest had already formed their opinion. In the back of a police van, Calvin sat cuffed, forehead bleeding, wrist swollen, body heavy with something far more painful than bruises. This wasn't just injustice, it was repetition. History, rewriting itself one more time. He stared at his hands, black skin against silver restraints, and wondered if they had ever seen anything else. In a holding cell barely larger than a broom closet, he sat slumped against the wall. His clothes were soaked, torn and clinging to wounds that pulsed with every breath. He could hear reporters outside, guards laughing down the hall. On the television mounted in the corner, a talking head asked, "Why would a Harvard janitor have access to secured facilities unless he was planning something?" Calvin didn't flinch, didn't move. He'd been here before, not in handcuffs, but in silence. When they stripped his credentials, when they called his research aggressive, when they erased his name from every faculty record. That was a prison too. He just hadn't recognized the bars. A knock on the door broke through the numbness. He didn't bother looking up. The door opened with a low squeak. Footsteps, measured, formal. Then a voice. Low, controlled. "I wasn't expecting to see you in here." Calvin looked up. Professor Gregory Bennett stood just inside the cell door, holding a manila folder in one hand, his face unreadable. Calvin's mouth tightened. "What do you want?" Bennett exhaled slowly, glancing down the hallway, as if to ensure no one was listening. "You're not the bomber," he said quietly. "No kidding," Calvin replied dryly. "I know who is," Bennett continued. "And I have proof." Calvin sat up straighter, eyes narrowing. "Why are you here?" Bennett hesitated, then stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Because 20 years ago, I let Harvard silence you. I knew your research wasn't plagiarized. I knew the student who took your work. I helped bury the complaint because I thought protecting the institution meant protecting our reputation." Calvin stared at him, stunned into silence. Bennett's voice cracked slightly. "And now Elias is trying to burn it all down. Not just because of what we did to his brother, but because of what I did to you. You were his hope, and I let you vanish." Calvin couldn't speak, not because he was forgiving him, but because he had never expected the truth to come from the mouth that helped bury him. "I have security access," Bennett said. "There's a drive in my office. It shows Elias entering the chemistry lab, shows him planting the bombs, shows him staging the manifesto in your name. I can get it, but I need your help." Calvin blinked. "Why?" "Because no one's going to believe me anymore. But they'll believe you if we can prove you were set up. Calvin shook his head slowly. You made me invisible. Now you want me to be your witness? No, Bennett replied. I want to help you destroy the system that made us both complicit. The door buzzed as a guard approached. You have 2 minutes, the officer barked. Bennett stepped back. I'll be back. I'll bring the footage. Calvin stared at him long and hard. Bring more than that, he said. Bring your voice. As the cell door closed, a news alert flashed across the TV screen. Breaking, second suspect now believed to be involved in Harvard bombing plot. A former professor once expelled for radical activism. Name withheld by authorities. Calvin's eyes locked on the screen as Bennett's voice echoed in his mind. We buried him. But he's coming for all of us now. Calvin Reddick sat on the narrow bench in the holding cell. As the fluorescent light above him flickered and hummed, the dull throb in his wrist settling into the ache in his bones. The world outside had already written him guilty a dozen times over, and every news headline that flashed across the tiny TV in the corner positioned him as a footnote in a story no one cared to understand fully. His bruised face was still visible in the low light, and he had learned something cold in these hours, that the public would rather cling to a simple villain than wrestle with a complicated truth about race, power, and erasure. In that space between breath and despair, the cell's lock rattled, and the door hissed open. Calvin lifted his gaze warily, expecting another officer ready with another accusation, another set of chains disguised as civility. Instead, Professor Gregory Bennett stepped through the threshold, hands in his coat pockets, no tie, no podium, no smug certainty, just a man with a face drained of color, eyes hollowed by something heavier than guilt. The arrogance that once clung to him like a second skin was gone, replaced by a creased brow and lips pressed tight as though holding back years of unspoken truth. Bennett didn't sit immediately. He stood just inside the door, a hesitant weight in the frame, watching Calvin with a look that seemed to flit between regret and resolve. For a long moment he said nothing, as though the silence itself bore the weight of every denial and dismissal he had ever enforced within Harvard's hallowed halls. Finally, in a voice that felt too soft for the room, he said, Calvin, I shouldn't be here. Calvin turned his head slightly, studying him with a gaze tempered by exhaustion and skepticism. I didn't think you had a conscience left, Calvin replied, his voice raw. There was no mockery in it, just astonishment that a man who once gleefully belittled him could now stare back with something akin to remorse. Bennett exhaled, a breath that seemed to release decades of stored defensiveness. I wasn't proud of it, he said. What I did, what we all did. I ignored warnings. I ignored him. He swallowed hard, eyes flicking away before returning to meet Calvin's. Elias wasn't just some disgruntled student. His brother's death, the harassment, the silence. You weren't the only one who knew what was happening. The admission landed like a stone dropped in still water, unexpected, heavy, rippling through the quiet of the cell. Calvin studied Bennett, the man who had humiliated him publicly, who had upheld the institution that chewed up and spat out black scholars without remorse. If Bennett felt guilt, it wasn't relief or redemption he saw in his face. It was fear, the kind that comes from realizing you held the thread that unraveled a life. When Calvin didn't respond right away, Bennett took another step into the cell, lowering his head as though preparing to carry a burden alone. You were telling the truth all along, he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. About your work, about what happened to you, about how the school treated you. I helped cover it up. I helped silence it. And I watched it happen again with Elias. Watched it and dismissed it. The words were weighed down with authenticity. And in that moment, Calvin felt a shift, not forgiveness, not trust, but undeniable clarity. Bennett had crossed a threshold into honesty, fragile as it was. Calvin met his gaze fully for the first time since Bennett entered. Then why are you here? He asked, voice steady. Bennett hesitated, then reached into his coat, pulling out a folded manila envelope, the edges worn as if handled repeatedly. Because I want to help you now. I need to confess publicly, on live television. I want to expose the cover-up, the dismissal of warnings, everything. I want to tell the world the truth about what Harvard did to you, to Elijah James, to his brother, to all of it. Calvin blinked, absorbing the gravity of what Bennett was proposing. Live television confessions could crumble institutions, or destroy reputations beyond repair. But this wasn't about reputation. It was about truth. Bennett's voice grew steadier as he spoke, as though unburdening himself was a matter of survival rather than redemption. I have contacts, journalists who will broadcast this. I can tell them exactly what happened, exactly how you were erased, exactly how warnings about Elias were ignored. But I can't do it alone. I need you there. You deserve your own voice. Doubt flickered in Calvin's eyes, but so did something else, a cautious hope. And what about the manifesto? He asked. The one they framed me with. The surveillance footage out of context. Bennett nodded, reaching deeper into the envelope. He pulled out a USB drive. This has the real footage. Security tapes showing Elias entering every staged area alone, planting devices, evading cameras, setting up the scene to implicate you. Harvard's internal logs, time-stamped, unedited. I copied it before they could delete everything. Maya's voice echoed in Calvin's mind. This is a setup, and he felt a flicker of righteous fire rise in his chest. Why would you do this now? He said, not accusatory, but searching for the truth that had suddenly become possible in this dim cell. Bennett looked down for a moment, then up, eyes locked with Calvin's. Because I saw what happened today, not just the explosion, not just the arrests, but how the story was twisted. I can't carry my silence anymore. You saved more than archives. You saved history. I need to stand with that. The sincerity in Bennett's voice was like a fracture in the wall Calvin had built around his trust. That same night, with Bennett's confession arranged and recorded for an upcoming live segment, Maya mobilized every follower, every journalist, every platform she could reach. The Sheen Free Calvin hashtag surged across social media, like wildfire. Clips of Bennett's preliminary admission, careful, composed, repentant, circulated with millions of views within hours. Protesters gathered outside the jail and in front of Harvard Yard, with signs demanding justice, transparency, and the truth about the university's systemic failures. There were chants, there were tears, there were speeches about history and memory, and the cost of silence. Across the nation, commentators debated the implications, some calling Calvin a hero, others demanding an urgent investigation, and a growing majority questioning how easily a black man could be framed and discarded by the very institution that claimed to shape future leaders. The tide of public opinion shifted, and with every repost, every quote, every shared tweet, Calvin felt something he hadn't felt in years, the possibility of being seen for who he truly was, rather than what history had forced him to become. But just as the momentum built and the world began to listen, not just watch, Calvin's phone buzzed incessantly in Bennett's office, where Maya and a small team had gathered. A news alert flashed across the screen, breaking. A new message from Elias. One final message on New Year's Eve. Maya stared at the text, her face paling as the implications unfurled in her mind. The statement was vague but deliberate, ominous, timed and broadcast through a network of anonymous channels that pushed it far and wide within minutes. One final message, Maya repeated, her voice tight. On New Year's Eve, Calvin's breath caught, a hollow twist in his chest. The last thing he expected was that Elias, the architect of chaos, the voice behind the bombings, and the man who had framed him, was still out there, still orchestrating and still demanding the world's attention on his terms. Bennett watched the room grow tense, but didn't flinch. He's trying to control the narrative again, he said quietly, his earlier resolve now laced with concern. He wants the last word. Calvin's eyes narrowed, not in fear, but in recognition of the pattern that had played out across decades of erased history, of voices silenced and rewritten by those in power. He wants spectacle, he murmured, not justice. Maya nodded slowly, already piecing together how to counter the looming threat on social media, preparing to mobilize the movement they had ignited. But Calvin felt something deeper, a chill that wasn't just anticipation, but realization that this battle, this story wasn't over, not by a long shot. As the clock on the wall ticked closer to midnight, Calvin's phone lit up again, this time with a video notification from an unknown number. He pressed play, and the screen filled with Elias's distorted voice saying, "On New Year's Eve the truth will burn brighter than your protests. I'll see you where it all began." The night air buzzed with anticipation, as Boston prepared for its grand New Year's Eve fireworks, a shimmering curtain of winter lights set to explode over the frozen Charles River. Inside the opulent Harvard Alumni Gala, crystal chandeliers refracted conversation like fractured stars, and men in tuxedos and women in gowns clinked glasses, while discussing endowments, donations, and legacy. It was an event designed to celebrate tradition and power, those who had ascended the ivory tower and never looked back. Calvin Reddick, temporarily released from custody under mounting public pressure and Bennett's televised confession, stood awkwardly near a marble column, a surveillance officer lingering a few feet behind him, like a shadow in a tailored suit. Behind the veneer of celebration, Calvin sensed a brittle tension crackling through the vaulted hall. The alumni smiled, posed and paraded their self-congratulation, unaware that Elias, once Malcolm James, the radical whose brother's death had been ignored, slipped among them in a borrowed tuxedo with a plan that was as quiet as it was devastating. A few feet away, Maya weaved through the crowd, her phone pressed to her ear as she tried again to convey urgency to a local police liaison. "He's here. I have reason to believe he's targeting this event," she hissed, dragging her coat sleeve across her brow. The liaison's voice was polite, dismissive, anchored in disbelief. "Maya, sweetie, a Harvard gala, with every dignitary and donor imaginable. He'd never get near the center of this without being noticed." She watched through the glittering crowd as influential alumni laughed over shrimp hors d'oeuvres, blissfully unaware of the danger unfolding beneath the gala's golden surface. Calvin's temporary release had been a symbolic gesture, authorities eager to placate protesters, eager to quiet the uproar without admitting error. They had assigned surveillance officers to trail him everywhere he went, believing that keeping Calvin visible and contained was safer than risking his re-entry into public sympathy. Yet Calvin, bruised still from being framed and dragged through the media, felt a pull he couldn't resist. If Elias was plotting something, he needed to be where the action was, not sidelined by police good intentions. With every careful step through the gala's labyrinth of antique rugs and Renaissance portraits, Calvin noticed little details that unsettled him. The slight shifts in the airflow near the grand stage where the alumni president was giving a speech. The flicker of a camera's red light pointed just a touch too deliberately toward a blank wall. The way some guests kept glancing past him as though they expected him to be dangerous. He half expected someone to ask him to leave. Instead, the crowd parted around him like water around an obstacle. Not because they respected him. They merely saw him as a curiosity, a brief flavor of news before the fireworks fizzled. Another scandal to be forgotten come January. Meanwhile, Maya became frantic. The liaison had finally agreed to send a small unit to verify her claims. But by the time her words reached uniformed officers at a distant precinct, the gala had shifted into its crescendo. A toast to old money and new pledges. Calvin felt a tightening in his chest as the speeches ended, and the orchestra began a soft rendition of Auld Lang Syne. The flicker of candles cast a gentle glow on the faces of those who for generations had never considered the cost of their comfort. And somewhere in that calm, Elias moved. Unseen in plain sight, his gaze narrowed as he scanned the room. He wasn't there to kill indiscriminately. He was there to puncture the myth of safety that people like these believed they possessed, to expose in the most public possible way that the elite could bleed just as the erased did. As Calvin stood near a massive oil painting of one of Harvard's founding presidents, an austere figure staring down as though blessing the gala, his eyes caught the brushwork, a detail off-kilter in the frame, a tiny bulge beneath the canvas edge. Yet he shook his head, dismissing it as fatigue. How could a bomb be hidden behind art at an event of this caliber? But something in his gut, honed by years of betrayal and erasure, whispered otherwise. Maya, sensing the festival's warmth sour, navigated through the crowd toward Calvin and then froze as she heard a faint click, the kind of mechanical sound that didn't belong in a room full of laughter and champagne flutes. She turned, phone now recording instinctively, and her eyes fell on a man who looked just a bit too composed, a man whose reflection didn't quite align with his surroundings. Elias. He was standing directly beneath a fresco of light cascading into stained glass, and he wasn't watching the speeches. He was watching Calvin. Maya's breath hitched when she glimpsed the subtle outline behind the very painting Calvin had just passed. She tugged on Calvin's sleeve, her voice urgent and low. "That painting, I think something's wrong. It's not decoration." Calvin's gaze followed hers, and a chill traveled down his spine as he approached the portrait. It was huge, painted in rich tones of burgundy and gold, depicting a revered founder of the university who had once been lauded for philanthropy, but whose legacy now carried unsavory shadow. Calvin reached out, brushing a fingertip against the frame's edge, and felt the indentation of metal beneath the wood. Not just paint and canvas, but a structure hollowed out to hold something else, the kind of space designed for concealment. His eyes narrowed, and his breath caught. This wasn't artistry, it was strategy. He leaned closer, detecting a tiny digital display blinking red, just at the corner of the frame. A bomb timer. The countdown hushed, methodical, merciless. Maya reached for Calvin's arm, her face pale but fierce. "We need to get out of here," she whispered, voice trembling. Calvin didn't move. Not yet. not when he could see the truth laid out in cold numbers ticking down beneath the painting that everyone here admired without question. The painting that overshadowed the gala's most powerful guests. He felt a wave of blood rage through his veins, not the blind anger Elias wielded, but the righteous fury of a man who had been erased for too long, and now saw the mechanisms of erasure repurposed as weapons. And he understood that if he didn't act, if he didn't expose this, the narrative would once again be rewritten to blame the man who had tried to save history, not destroy it. Maya's phone vibrated in her hand. A flurry of alerts, messages from protesters following the live stream, commentators finally waking up to her warnings, and then a single message from an unknown number. "We see you." Maya's expression flickered with a mixture of dread and defiance. Calvin pressed his hand over the timer's edge, careful not to touch any wires, calculating, feeling more alive in that instant than he had since the first bomb was discovered. Around him the gala continued in ignorant splendor, unaware that history was not only unearthing itself, it was dangling by the thread of a ticking clock beneath a revered portrait that few here understood, and none here respected enough to question. Calvin looked at the painting, then at Maya, then back at the digital display blinking its eventual doom. As the countdown dropped into the final seconds, 00000000000000000000023. Calvin watched in stunned silence as the screen opened on Elias's face, framed by the gala's chandelier lights, whispering, "When the past is ignored, the present becomes weaponized." Then the feed cut out, just as the final second ticked toward zero. Calvin Reddick stood in the grand gala hall, the entire room still a swirl of oblivious laughter, champagne flutes raised, and oblivious to the storm beneath their feet. The police had cordoned off the perimeter, instantaneously transforming the celebration into a scene smeared with urgency and confusion. Uniformed officers, media camera crews, and flashing lights blending with the glittering chandeliers overhead. Noel carols played on a nearby speaker, a dissonant soundtrack to ironic danger, while guests tried to process the sudden shift from festivity to fear. But Calvin's focus was singular. In front of him, just inches above the polished oak floor, hung the painting that oversized tribute to tradition, legacy, and illusion. Within its gilded frame was the final bomb, hidden so precisely that only Calvin's intuition, sharpened by every betrayal and erasure he'd survived, had led them to it. His hands trembled, the skin pale and slick with sweat, as he faced the most consequential moment of his life. It was not a battlefield he ever wanted to enter, but it was one he had been confronting since the day his voice was dismissed as a janitor's echo. Police formed a loose shield around him, cautious and unsure, alerted by Maya's frantic warnings, but still trying to navigate what was rapidly becoming one of the most confusing New Year's Eve events in recent history. Calvin raised no weapon. He carried no tools other than the quiet strength that had carried him through decades of injustice. His eyes were fixed on the painting's corner, where he now saw the slight bulge of the theraplate disguised as decorative flourish. Behind it throbbed the last countdown, a dead man's whisper that threatened to rewrite reality in an instant. He wasn't just diffusing a device, he was diffusing a narrative that had been built on erasure, misinterpretation, and the dismissal of truth at every turn. Nearby, Maya crouched behind a music table for cover, recording everything, not just with her phone pointed at Calvin, but with her eyes locked tightly on every face in the crowd. She caught glimpses of confusion, fear, and denial on the jaws and cheeks of the gala's elite. Some whispered, some turned away. Others cried out in sudden shock when the bomb's timer ticked audibly overhead. It read 0000000000000. "Calvin," Maya whispered, but her voice was more plea than name. But he didn't stop. In that moment, the crowd was more than bystanders. They were the embodiment of a system that had celebrated his humiliation, ignored his brilliance, and defined him by the label they stuck on him. Here they stood again, unaware and unseeing, poised on a new tragedy they still didn't realize they were part of. And then, footsteps, unknown to the police, hidden among the gala guests, was Elias. He had shed the borrowed tuxedo he used to blend in with the alumni. Now he stood in a plain black coat, face partially obscured under a hat, fashioned to look casual, yet unobtrusive. The crowd's edge blurred around him, and his eyes, sharp and burning with bitter triumph, fixed on Calvin. No sirens or flashing lights pierced his gaze, only the cold, calculated certainty that his message needed closure. He didn't cheer, he watched, silent, waiting, hoping to see the panic he believed would validate his entire mission. Elias's lips parted slightly as he stepped forward, not toward salvation, but toward spectacle. "Finish it, Reddick," he murmured, voice low enough to be drowned by the music, but audible to Calvin in the electric stillness of that moment. Destroy the facade. Let them watch their icons fall. The crowd didn't notice the exchange. Only Maya did, her phone's video capturing it like a flicker of truth in a sea of polished lies. Calvin's response was not fear. It was sorrow. Not only for what Elias had become, but for what the institution had taught him to believe about himself. This isn't destruction, Calvin said quietly. And I'm not the threat. Truth is the only thing that's ever carried a wound this deep. His fingers hovered over the decorative plate. The seconds disappeared in a blur of focus that narrowed his universe to a single point. The device. The frame. The future dangling by a thread of math and nerve. 0000. The painting, once admired as art, now felt like a shroud, an emblem of misremembered history that had to be stripped away. He reached for the pressure plate's tiny clip with a calm so profound it startled even the officers watching. In his mind, he saw the faces of every student who had once dismissed him, every administrator who looked past him, every person who reduced him to a role that fit their comfort. All of them faded as he prepared to do what he had trained for in spirit, if not profession: disarm the lie. 00. Thin droplets of sweat fell onto the ornate frame, but Calvin barely noticed. His entire life had led to this. The sum of every microaggression, every dismissal, every assumption that he was less than, every erased footnote, every ghost kept unremembered. He focused on a final wire, red and black, an old configuration but twisted here with deception, and paused. The choice was not random. It was intentional, a puzzle meant for a mind trained in logic, but clouded by years of being underestimated. He slid a slender fingertip between the wires.
00000, sorry.
And there was nothing. The ticking stopped. Everyone in the room exhaled at once. A collective breath that sounded like release rather than panic. The timer's digits blinked out, and the small device beneath the painting went dark. Calvin gently breathed. Not relieved, not triumphant, clarified. The painting, still hanging, felt obsolete. The crowd erupted loud, confused, emotional. Some laughed with relief. Others wept, shaken by the near miss. Police swarmed forward to secure the frame and confirm the threat was gone. Flashbulbs popped everywhere. Reporters hollered questions, weaving narratives in real time, but none of them captured what happened inside Calvin's mind. The pulling away of a lifetime of accusations that had been written in haste and erased in ignorance. Then movement from the crowd, a commotion on the far end as someone drew a uniform closer. Someone already identified by badge and service. Detective Mason, a young officer called out, his voice cracking with shock and recognition. It took a moment for Calvin to register who they were referring to, but when he did, his heart already pummeled by years of erasure, thudded in a way that wasn't fear but emotional astonishment. It was Thomas Mason, once Calvin's student, once a young man on the verge of losing himself to the very institutional silencing Calvin taught against. And now a police officer. Thomas pushed through the crowd, uniform crisp, face flushed, eyes locked on Elias, who was attempting to disappear behind flustered guests, hood drawn low, expression startled by a capture he didn't expect. "Don't let him go," Thomas yelled, his voice measured but urgent. "That man set every bomb here tonight." The crowd parted in a rush, and the police officers nearest Elias instinctively moved in, not violently, but authoritatively, collapsing the space between accusation and consequence. Elias tried to meet Calvin's eyes, once an echo of someone who demanded to be heard, and for the first time his expression flickered with something unguarded, not triumph, but vulnerability. Thomas reached Elias before he could dart into a service corridor. When he did, his eyes flicked to Calvin, and something in his gaze spoke of deeper depth than protocol. "You saved my life in chem lab," Thomas said, voice lined with calm intensity. "You kept me from walking away from school. You told me not to let their noise drown my purpose." Calvin's chest tightened, but words weren't needed. In that moment, a displacement of power once taken, now returned, rippled through him more deeply than any applause or relief cry in the room. Police cuffed Elias, his shoulders slumping, the mask of righteousness there, one moment, gone the next. And as he was led away, hundreds of cameras swiveled, broadcasting every breath he took. The crowd quieted again, this time in awe, not panic, as reporters rushed to capture Calvin's presence at the heart of it all. A news anchor's voice rose over the chaos, crisp, poised, and already framing the moral question of the day.
Harvard hero or hidden threat?
The debate over Calvin Reddick continues.
And as those words echoed across every screen, every social feed, and every stunned mind in the gala hall turned epicenter, Calvin realized something profound. History didn't just need to be saved. It needed to be understood. Across the glittering screens of global news outlets, a single headline began to spread. The Painted Man. Why the final bomb was hidden in plain sight. And beneath it a creeping subtext. Is Calvin Reddick's act of heroism enough to rewrite a lifetime of suspicion? Or will the world forever see him as the threat they once accused him of being? Calvin Reddick stood on the dais beneath the soaring columns of Harvard's newly opened Black History Center, a building that only existed because he refused to let truth be buried. The room was filled with faces that once looked through him. Alumni, scholars, students, reporters, families of those whose stories had been silenced. All gathered for a ceremony that pulsed with meaning far beyond champagne toasts and polite applause. Cameras lined the marble floors like sentinels, capturing every nuance of his expression, the slight tightening at the corners of his eyes when someone mentioned justice instead of forgiveness, the quiet pride that flickered when Maya stood in the front row, no longer just a student with a phone, but a national reporter whose documentary series had become the heartbeat of a cultural reckoning. In the months since the bombing and the explosive revelations that followed, Harvard had been forced to confront its own legacy of exclusion, cover-ups and racial blind spots. Calvin had been reinstated not as a janitor, a word loaded with belittlement, but as distinguished lecturer in social justice history, a title earned not just through scholarship but through the courage to expose truth that many powerful people wanted to remain buried. As President Winslow spoke, offering an apology that had once seemed impossible, Calvin watched faces in the crowd shift, some nodding with heartfelt remorse, others stiff with discomfort as they encountered accountability for the first time. The speeches spoke of reconciliation and renewal, but beneath it all was a fundamental shift. Harvard could no longer pretend that its erasures were harmless footnotes. They were injustices with consequences, and Calvin, once dismissed, once silenced, had become a living testament to what happens when truth refuses to die. After the president finished, the crowd walked into the new archives wing, where floor-to-ceiling glass cases showcased documents that had been hidden for decades. Letters from Black alumni kept off official walls, protest signs from unacknowledged uprisings, faculty reports of racial harassment that had once vanished into locked drawers. In the center of the room, bathed in a soft amber glow, stood a plaque that read, "From Janitor to Guardian, Calvin Reddick, the man who saved the truth." Calvin felt the crowd part, their reverence a tidal shift from the laughter and dismissal that had once greeted him in lecture halls and corridors. A young black student approached him, eyes gleaming with tears, and whispered, "You didn't just save history, you gave us a future." Calvin's voice caught. He had spent years trying to reject fame, believing it a distraction from justice. But here in this quiet reverence, he realized that recognition could be a vessel for the stories of others, the ones who never made plaques or headlines. Maya captured it all with her camera, her narration ready beneath her breath for the documentary now scheduled for national release. History isn't written by the comfortable, it's written by the courageous. As the guests filtered into smaller rooms, sipping tea and discussing curriculum changes, Calvin stepped aside, drawn to a wall of quotes from civil rights leaders, whose words had once been footnotes in required readings. One quote by an alumna expelled for protest struck him. "Those who are erased become the archivists of resistance." The irony was not lost on him. Once erased, he now helped preserve the voices once tossed aside. A man in a suit approached, introduced himself as the chair of the newly established Calvin Reddick Scholarship Fund, created to support scholars of color in historical and social justice research. Calvin thanked him, but his gaze drifted to the faces of young students clustered around Maya, asking her what it felt like to cover a story that changed a nation's narrative. Maya answered with passion, and Calvin watched her confidently articulate the fractures and hope in their culture, an unexpected twist on how one act of storytelling, humble in its origin, snowballed into a movement with global resonance. Yet even as the applause and congratulations wrapped around him like a warm cloak, a subtle discord tugged at the edges of the moment. Not everyone at Harvard had embraced the shift. In the crowd lingered a few faces that flickered with guarded irritation rather than repentance. Professors and alumni whose relationships to tradition felt threatened by transparency. They listened politely, but their eyes remained cool, as if wondering whether the world watching would ever fully understand why they hesitated to embrace change. Calvin felt it not as animosity but as another form of resistance, the kind that doesn't explode or make headlines, but quietly whispers that certain truths make people uncomfortable. In that tension he saw both the progress and the unfinished work. Real transformation, he realized, did not end at an apology ceremony or a scholarship. It lived in the daily choice to face history without flinching, to remember what was once forgotten, and to teach others to do the same. Later, when the formal ceremony concluded, Calvin found a moment alone in the center of the archives, surrounded by cases that once only existed in secrecy. He closed his eyes, letting the weight of the day settle, a mix of triumph, sorrow, and irrevocable change. Maya approached with her camera off now, just as a friend rather than a reporter. She handed him a folder she'd been carrying. Inside were stories collected from students and community members whose lives had been touched by his journey. Stories of siblings inspired to speak up, parents who finally saw their children represented, professors who pledged to restructure curricula. "This is the ripple you started," she said softly. "Not just at Harvard, but everywhere people saw your story." Calvin looked down at the folder, feeling an unfamiliar peace, not born of vindication, but of purpose fulfilled and purpose still unfolding. But even in this moment of recognition, something pulled his attention outward, toward the horizon visible through the tall library windows. It was dusk, the sky a deepening wash of violet and gold, and for a brief second, the sun seemed to catch on the edge of a new chapter. Yet beneath that beauty, a whisper of uncertainty remained, like a reminder that truth once revealed always calls for vigilance. Maya lowered her voice, as though feeling the same ripple of anticipation. "We still haven't heard Elias's final testimony," she said. The name hovered in the quiet space between them, a reminder that even those who struck down truth once justified by pain and erasure, were now part of the narrative that required illumination. Calvin's gaze tightened, not with fear, but with resolve. Somewhere beyond the wall of exhibits, an assistant approached with news that a single archived tape missing from the public collection had been found, labeled Testament of A. James. The file read simply Elias James, unfiltered. It had never been accessed before. Calvin didn't open it yet. He felt the weight of history in his fingertips, knowing that even now the truth still had layers. And as the screen in Maya's edit suite lit up once more, she began narrating her documentary. This story began with a lie, and ended with the truth no one wanted to admit. But just as the screen faded to black, the tape titled Testament of A. James flickered to life on the monitor, showing Elias not angry, but whispering something unexpected. "You think history is done with me? Wait until you hear the part they never recorded. If you believe truth should never be silenced, no matter who's holding the broom or the badge, type yes in the comments. What would you have done if the world erased your voice and called you a threat for telling the truth?" Subscribe to hear the stories they tried to bury, because remembering isn't enough. We must make sure it never happens again.